There is progress. It's a very fragile and limited kind of progress, but it's an improvement on a year ago.
First of all, North Korea has not ended the hostilities. It's not exactly a peaceful peninsula.
We have no intention of initiating war against North Korea. We can get something for acknowledging the obvious. I would not be averse to it.
A declaration for declaration might be possible. A declaration of North Korea's holdings in exchange for a declaration of an end to the war.
What do you think of the cooperation, coordination between the United States and South Korea?
And they're out of sync on the need for a declaration of the end of the war. A divergence in public opinion could spell trouble.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. It's been 2 months since the Singapore summit, and North Korea has yet to take tangible steps toward denuclearization. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo continues to say progress is being made. What is beneath his diplomatic words? What does the U.S. want from North and South Korea? Today, we discuss this with our panel of experts.
한반도의 완전한 비핵화와 함께 종전선언과 평화협정으로 가기 위한 발걸음을 내디딜 것입니다.
My guest today, Mr. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. O'Hanlon has been focusing on U.S. defense strategy and national security policy for the past 30 years. Also joining us today, Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Americas. Mr. Fitzpatrick has a 26-year career in the State Department and was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
My first question, Secretary Pompeo maintains that there is progress. So what is the intended message here, if any one of you can start us off?
You know, Secretary Pompeo is America's chief diplomat, but he's also the chief salesman for America's diplomacy. And when the president announced in June that North Korea had made tremendous progress in denuclearization, Secretary of State has to support that and claim that indeed there is progress, even though to us observers it's not visible. We don't know what's going on beneath the surface. It's possible that there is progress in the talks, but he's putting up a good face.
Now, the United States held the first ever summit with North Korea to give diplomacy a chance, but we don't see any substantial progress as yet. What would the United States want from North Korea at this time?
Well, first of all, I think Mark's analysis is excellent and spot on about what's going on. We don't really know, but Mr. Pompeo is going to try to maintain momentum. It is worth remembering that we have seen an effective freeze for freeze on testing and large exercises. That is going on. That's not enough. That doesn't prevent the North Koreans from expanding their arsenals of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, but it's still better than where we were in 2017. So let's not forget that. We all knew that the definitions of denuclearization in Washington and Pyongyang were very different. We all knew that President Trump was probably only gradually realizing that his vision for very near-term complete denuclearization was unrealistic. I'd rather see an ugly, slow, frustrating diplomatic process than where we were last year. So in that sense, there is progress. It's a very fragile and limited kind of progress, but it's an improvement on a year ago.
So, Mr. Fitzpatrick, in this stalemate, what would the United States want from North Korea?
Well, the United States wants North Korea to follow through with its pledge for eventual denuclearization. The United States would like North Korea to agree to a definition of denuclearization that meets the U.S. definition. The United States is asking for a lot. They want complete end to all of North Korea's nuclear programs. They want that to include all of North Korea's delivery systems, both long-range and short-range ballistic missiles, and they even include chemical weapons and any potential biological weapons, which is actually natural since those are also in the category of weapons of mass destruction. So they want an agreement on what denuclearization means, then an agreement on actual implementation of a dismantling and a disabling strategy with verification to ensure that it is complete and irreversible. That's the U.S. want. Are they going to get all that? Very likely not, but that's their position going in.
Now, the North Korea is questioning U.S. intentions and nervous about security guarantee because last week, North Korea's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho visited Iran and he said North Korea believes U.S. will never give up on its hostile policy on North Korea. So if North Korea is less hesitant and more sincere about negotiations, do you think there can be a breakthrough?
I think there's a natural deal to be done. And I think the basic deal is a sequenced deal in which we first go for a verifiable elimination of production capability in North Korea, and only later work out the details on complete denuclearization. And in fact, we may not even get there, ever, and certainly not in the first term of a Trump administration. But there still could be an interim deal in which we essentially, as we've seen the IAEA do elsewhere, get a submission from North Korea of a database on all of its major production facilities. There will be some kind of an ability for North Korea to protect small little sites where they might keep their warheads. But the big places where they have centrifuges, where they have plutonium production facilities and reprocessing facilities, long-range missile factories, ideally, would be on this database. International inspectors would then go in and verify the contents of the database and see the facilities. Then, when North Korea allows for these facilities to be destroyed or dismantled, then you get a fuller elimination or revoking of some of those sanctions, and maybe some more humanitarian aid.
Now, what North Korea wants is the end to the declaration to the end to the Korean War. What are U.S. reservations about this idea?
You know, when U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, Harry Harris, said that it's too early to declare an end to the Korean War, it's, you know, one has to think, gosh, 65 years is too early. But, you know, the United States has always been cautious about declaring an end to hostilities because, first of all, North Korea has not ended hostilities. They've conducted so many incursions, armed attacks, and other provocations that it's not exactly a peaceful peninsula. Secondly, the United States wants something before they would give up something. And North Korea having taken the move toward creating nuclear weapons has raised the ante. The United States needs more than it would have needed before North Korea had nuclear weapons. So, you know, I think in line with the kind of ideas that Michael was saying about a sequencing, and one could call it action for action, a declaration for declaration might be possible. A declaration of North Korea's holdings in exchange for a declaration of an end to the war. That's the kind of conceivable sequencing that I think could be possible. But, you know, right now the Trump administration would like more than just a declaration. They'd like the whole retinue of demands met.
If I could pick up on that very quickly, that's a very intriguing concept. And I think Mark is right to encourage us to be a little more flexible about how we think of a peace treaty. It doesn't have to be accompanied with pomp and circumstance. It doesn't have to lead to a reception for Kim Jong-un in Washington or, you know, a state dinner. It can be done more matter-of-factly and simply reflect the basic fact that we have no intention of initiating war against North Korea, which I think is a fact. And therefore, if we can get something for acknowledging the obvious, I would not be averse to it. And I think the traditional American view that we have to get a lot before we give a peace treaty almost can reinforce this North Korean paranoia that somehow we are potentially the offensive-minded party. I think we're not, and I think they really know we're not. But again, if we can get something for that kind of a statement or a simple signature on a piece of paper that there is not going to be a conflict and neither side wants it and both sides consider themselves to be in a state of peace, you know, a cold peace so far, a hostile peace in some sense, but nonetheless a state of non-belligerence. I think that could be a useful step if we can get the right thing in return.
And I think it's important to note that, you know, what we're talking about here is a declaration, not a whole full-scale peace treaty, as you said, with all the belt and whistles and so forth. There's a staging here. There's a declaration of an end, you know, the U.S. intention that you noted, and then a peace treaty working it all out, and the process that would be accompanying that. That could take some time.
I want to talk about South Korea before we go, though. What do you think of the coordination between the United States and South Korea? Because amid the stalemate, State Department emphasizes that there is good coordination with South Korea.
You know, I'm sure that there's good coordination between the governments, and they talk all the time at various levels. They're very, they're close, and they've been in sync from the beginning, despite the concerns that the Moon Jae-in government on its progressive path would be giving away the store to North Korea. They haven't. They've maintained a firm position on sanctions and so forth. But what I worry about is that the South Korean government and most of the people seem to agree with North Korea on the need for a declaration of the end of the war. And they're out of sync with the United States on that. And, you know, so far, bureaucratically, they've been able to keep it together. But I'm afraid that the divergence in public opinion could spell trouble maybe in the near future.
It's a good point, because in addition to this dilemma of disagreement over a declaration, we've also got change in the U.S. Relationship with Korea. We see that General Brooks is probably going to leave in coming months. Also now we have Admiral Harris in position. He's a very capable guy, but he's more of a classic hawk. And of course, the Chinese will be the first to tell you that. So for those reasons, and because of the tumultuous nature of South Korean politics, which I think so far President Moon has kept controlled over, but you know, it's only going to be a short time before we start thinking about a new presidential race in South Korea, and President Moon can't run for re-election. You know, there are the makings of a less happy alliance relationship over the next year or two if we're not careful.
Just before we go, just briefly, what does the United States want from South Korea at this point?
I think the United States has been getting from South Korea what it wants, which is this coordination of policy, a consensus, no daylight between them vis-a-vis North Korea in terms of the maximum pressure that's being applied to North Korea, no relaxation in sanctions.
Well, we'll wrap it up here and watch video for our next discussion. The Trump administration announced new sanctions against Chinese and Russian companies helping North Korea. These companies facilitated illegal shipments to North Korea, including alcohol, tobacco, and refined oil products, in violation of U.S. and UN sanctions. Now, the blacklisting of the Chinese and Russian companies, what is the message here?
I think the message to all companies that are engaged in illicit trade with North Korea is that we will find you, we will catch you, and we will fine you. We will penalize you. It's a message to all those firms doing business with North Korea, and it's also a message to North Korea that you need to denuclearize or the pressure will keep on.
Now, the U.S. Treasury back in February announced those variety of shipping practices that North Korea uses to evade sanctions. Why is a shipping area the main focus in sanctions evasion by North Korea?
North Korea has been doing this continuously. And frankly, the sanctions from last year are so severe that in the absence of some cheating, I think the North Korean economy could probably decline 20 or 30%. And what we know is that the last measurement I saw was that it declined maybe 3.5%, 4% in 2017 as those sanctions kicked in. So what we're seeing is an ongoing process where the enforcement and the cheating are in competition. And depending on just where we wind up, we'll see the North Korean economy decline another 5% or another 10% or maybe stay flat. And that's the range of likely outcomes here. So I'm not surprised. But what's important is the North Koreans know there will be no really meaningful let-up in the sanctions enforcement until they make a deal. And it's crucial that that be understood. So I welcome these additional applications of sanctions.
And then, if I may just address the specific question you asked about why the focus on the shipping. Probably most North Korean sanctions evasion occurs on the land border with China. It's smaller scale. It's trucks and trains. They're harder to actually spot in terms of getting photographs of them. Ships are bulky, and you can take pictures with if you can just find them. So it's not so much that the focus is mostly on the shipping, which is that's the easier things to catch and the more obvious.
Now, the UN sanctions report says that North Korea maintains 245 joint venture companies with Chinese and Russian firms. How can we close the gap in sanctions hole? How can we close the hole in sanctions utilizing these resources in the United States, in the United Nations, and the NGOs and other governments?
Well, I think there's a two-track process. One is you keep at it. You keep trying to find the individual firms and try to put pressure on the governments of China, South Korea, Russia to shut them down. And then you do have the secondary sanctions concept, which is that you start saying first to those firms and then maybe even to their governments and to the broader sectors of their economy, we are going to start penalizing, we Americans are going to start penalizing you and preventing you from dealing with us and our economy if you don't shut these things down. So we're not just going to ask for help, we're going to punish the violators of the sanctions with these indirect secondary sanctions that got a bad name back in the 1990s when they were first used in regard to Iran and some other countries, but are becoming, frankly, a very potent weapon and recognized to be one way around this conundrum that you correctly identified.
The difficulty with the secondary sanctions is that they're generally applied against the firm,
right,
to blackballing it from doing business with the United States if they do business with North Korea. But a lot of these Chinese firms don't do business with the United States, so they're insulated from U.S. sanctions. So to answer your question, how do we, the concerned states of the world, stop it? You need Chinese government buy-in to this. And that's harder after, as Michael mentioned, the Singapore summit seemed to relax the pressure. And also, given that the United States has been at loggerheads with China and Russia on so many other issues, they are not willing, out of the goodness of their heart, to do things to please the United States by cracking down on business with North Korea.
So to pick up on that, for example, I think President Trump is correct to say we have an economic relationship with China that needs some fixing, but I think the across-the-board tariff approach is not very good. And one of the reasons is that it takes that tool away from us to enforce these sanctions. I would rather see the United States, if we're going to impose 10, 20% tariffs on Chinese goods, do it in sectors of the Chinese economy where we know a lot of firms are cheating on their North Korea obligations.
Right. Last question. This is very important. I wanted both your opinions. So should and can the United States impose secondary sanctions on South Korean companies that imported North Korean coal recently?
You know, I was disgusted when I saw this news that South Korea, our ally, companies are doing business with North Korea in defiance of UN and U.S. sanctions. It's amazing to me. So certainly the United States can impose secondary sanctions. Should they? They should give the South Korean government the first chance to stop this. Now, this happened last year, it was 2017, and what we know is the result of a 10-month investigation. So obviously the South Korean government has been looking at this, and one hopes that they will take steps to stop it. If they don't, I think it's a tool the United States can reserve.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, my short answer is yes. I think Mark gave the more thorough, correct answer. But I would say, to your question, yes, we should be willing to do that pretty soon if the problem's not fixed.
We'll end it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today is taken at the Mangyongdae Children's Palace in Pyongyang. South Korean President Kim Dae-jung visited this place in 2000 on the sidelines of his summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. Now, Mr. Fitzpatrick, what's your reaction?
Oh, I see my grandchildren in this photo. I mean, this is a natural human reaction. You see smiling children, you're happy about this, but you can't help but wonder, are these smiles forced? And the training, the regimen that is imposed on these kids, you know, for these mass games is pretty horrific. So I think we have to look beyond the smile.
Mr. O'Hanlon?
Yeah, I mean, maybe these are the kids of regime loyalists who are well-fed and happier, you know, as opposed to a random assortment of North Korean kids. But it does remind you of the human tragedy here as well, that we know that even though not everybody in North Korea suffers, a lot of people do. And these children look happy. A lot of children in North Korea are not happy. And that's why we've got to get after this. You know, the weapons of mass destruction part has to be our first strategic concern. There's a lot of other priorities here that we need to get after too. And once we get towards an interim deal on WMD, maybe we can start addressing some of the humanitarian questions as well.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Fitzpatrick, Mr. O'Hanlon, thank you for joining us.
Happy to talk to you today.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.